Good morning, Gadi Brenner. Congratulations and everyone on putting together this wonderful meeting. It's shaping up as promised, hopefully. And as you heard, I had some interest in the Y chromosome. In 2002, I first became a grandfather, and reading to my grandchildren, I realized what really matters is maternal ancestry, not maternal ancestry, and then started studying mitochondrial DNA. Actually, I've shifted my interest once again back to my roots as a nephrologist. That's what I am by my business card. I've gone to genetics of kidney disease, and therefore I rely very heavily, and in this talk, you'll see most of the talk and most of the presentation is provided by Shai Karmi, who's in the audience in his pictures here, Shai Tsur, and others. And they provided many of the concepts and many of the slides. And it really, the interest though, with this shift to mitochondrial DNA was heralded by 3 publications, particularly the middle one, in which Doron, who really should be giving this talk, because, you know, when Harry said an interest in mtDNA, if I have a real difficult question in genetics in general, especially in mtDNA, I will often turn, or most often turn to Doron. And there's a famous saying in the Talmud, one is never envious of one's sons or students. And I think Doron has done, you know, obviously it's needless to say very well. I'm going to divide my talk into 2 components. One is the contentious question of mtDNA and Jewish identity determination. And the second is phylogeographic origins, so the Ashkenazi maternal founder lineages described in the middle of those 3 papers, going back to Doron's work. So let's start with this topic of mtDNA and Jewish identity determination. So first of all, I think in the spirit of what we heard from Lord Winston and what we're all thinking about, using DNA or any biological test in a non-forensic identity or group membership determination, is that ever legitimate? Is it a slippery slope to accusations of racism? Can there ever be a legitimate use? So this obviously could be a 3-day discussion just dealing with this one topic. And I'm going to try to simplify it into one slide for the purposes of this particular presentation. And that, I would say and submit, that use of DNA information by an agency, government or non-government, for establishing differential status of the rights and benefits of individuals or communities and even society is something we should back away from, at least I would. However, on the other hand, I do believe that there is the freedom of individuals of their own volition to obtain information about themselves and to seek scientifically based, best effort, non-agenda driven interpretation of that information. I don't think we can be paternalistic and deny people the availability to do that. So that's like the difference between asking, are you Jewish, and am I born Jewish? Why would somebody even ask that question? There may be many reasons that people ask that question and actually pay money to try to figure some of these things out. They may have a transcendental feeling. They may have incidentally discovered that they carry an Ashkenazi Tay-Sachs mutation. Maybe someone was told by their mother on her deathbed that she was born Jewish. And some people want not to be Jewish, and you can see that you don't actually need to do DNA testing. You can read a whole book or manual on how someone stopped being Jewish. And that's Shlomo Sandfeld. Now, let's say someone is thinking about this and is not a geneticist, and is not in the field. After hearing Doron's explanation of evolution, they would understand it fully, but let's say they haven't heard that. And they read a newspaper, and what do they read? They see this, many articles have been written. This is an interview by Brenda Maddox. She interviewed me a number of years ago after Doron's paper about these 4 Jewish founding lineages for Ashkenazi Jews, maternal lineages, and might say, after reading this article, maybe I should sequence my mitochondrial DNA to help me achieve a greater level of certainty about my ancestry or about myself. They can ask that question. And they will go and try to read the American Journal of Human Genetics paper, and they will see that described in that paper are these 4 large founding lineages, which have names, 3 of them under the K and one B, which account for fully 40% of the contemporary Ashkenazi population. And indeed, shortly after the online version of that paper was published, Amy Harmon from the New York Times called me and asked if she could be tested. She very much wanted to know about her own personal ancestry. And being a research lab at the Technion and the Faculty of Medicine, I said, we really can't do that. We work under, oops, what happened? Helsinki, and we can't test identified individuals. She went ahead and had herself tested in other ways and wrote an article in the New York Times. She was actually a member of one of these founding lineages and was very pleased about that and made her feel good, and that's fine. That's great that it made her feel good. Now, I want to say that although this presentation deals mostly with this 4 founding lineages in the Ashkenazi Jewish community, a very important work has been done and will be presented shortly with respect to the other major Jewish diaspora communities which have been well studied with similar founder lineage questions and identity questions, and a lot of the work has been done in major centers in Spain and Portugal, and of course I add to Gadi's congratulations of the Euro Cup to Portugal. So what does the finding mean? So we already heard from, I think Lord Winston said, a good way to answer a question when you're in doubt is ask another question. So here is the questions that people might ask. They might ask, will the state of Israel accept me as a citizen based on the law of return? Will a rabbinic court in Israel allow me to marry a Jewish person? Can I consider myself to be maternally descendant from the same woman who recently transmitted her mtDNA to 1.7 million Ashkenazi Jews, some non-Ashkenazi Jews, and a few contemporary non-Jews? Should this change my self-perception in any way? So how we approach the information might very well depend on what the person has in mind or what question they really have in mind, rather than giving a blanket answer. And one can envision 2 kinds of approaches. One, a genealogic approach, similar to maybe the Horowitz example we just saw, where you use mtDNA as an archival record. You're using it as if you have a book going back, looking at mother, grandmother, great-grandmother, and so forth, and that might make some sense in terms of those who follow the maternal lineage or conversion entry into the Jewish people. And that would be one kind of approach which can be used and has been used with archival records since Talmudic times at least, say. Another approach is a purely Bayesian approach which does not use really the maternal lineage inheritance other than the way it has changed the relative frequencies of the different mtDNA haplogroups. So one thing about these major founding lineages is that they have very different frequencies between Jews and non-Jews. So these, and that's illustrated here schematically in a slide that Shai Carmi prepared. And one can then say, okay, if I have an mtDNA which places me in a group which is more frequent among Jews compared to non-Jews, what can that tell me, if anything, using a Bayesian approach? So that's well known to many. So you have some kind of prior probability, the test is done, and then you use the simple Bayesian analysis to say, okay, how has that now affected my probability of being in this group who self-identify as Jews? So, for example, if we take one of these founding lineages, which is present in 20% of Ashkenazi Jews, K1A, B1A, then we know that frequency with relative certainty. And now we know that the frequency is low among non-Jews, but we don't know with what certainty. And probably we can give a number of not more than 1 in 1,000. And then one can just run it. So the prior here was the prior probability of being Jewish. Well, that's very subjective. It may reflect some prior knowledge that we may have about ourselves. For a random person from a given population, it may just be the proportion of Jews in that population. And one can update based on accumulation of evidence, even autosomal evidence, for example, doing autosomal sequencing. So consider a carrier of this particular mtDNA, and assuming these numbers of 20% and 0.1%, so with a flip coin prior of 50-50, the result would raise the posterior to 99.5%. If we're talking about a group in which we say, well, there's 5% of the people are Jewish, I don't know, I have this K1A1, B1A, then it would raise it to 67%, and you can see the numbers here. Someone is very certain, hasn't done much, it's moved them from 90 to 99%. What are the advantages of this approach? It's technically simple, relies on very well-established mathematics and sequencing. However, it's insensitive to the precise haplogroup frequency in Jews for these large lineages. For smaller lineages, that's not the case. Conceptually, it's simple because it looks at the arbitrary nature of the distinction between Jews and non-Jews. That arbitrary nature does really not affect the validity. It doesn't require statements about the origin, which I'll get to in a minute, of the founder haplogroups, or the Jewishness of long-deceased carriers of these haplogroups. Nothing inherently special about the mtDNA other than the different frequencies of the founding lineages between contemporary Jews and non-Jews. It's just a discriminating marker of some sort. And it doesn't assume causality between DNA and Jewishness, just association. Disadvantages: it is sensitive to the precise haplogroup frequency in non-Jews, often not that well known. There's many more, and it's hard to sample a big enough number. And rarely the posterior, could be lower than the prior. Conceptually, there are disadvantages. It involves a very subjective assessment of the prior. It makes no use of this genealogic information about matrilineal association with Jewish identity at all. And it assumes, and I put this forth as a conceptual disadvantage, that each person is inherently born either Jewish or non-Jewish, but that underlying state is hidden, and we need to estimate its probability. So a philosophical, conceptual question. I actually, was never really very interested in my own origins or DNA, but for the purposes of this talk, I rushed, and with Doron's help, and got my own mtDNA checked, and found out that I was not one of the a descendant of one of the major Ashkenazi founding lineages, J1C7A, for whatever that means. And I'm pretty sure that I'm Jewish, so I gave my prior at 0.999, and my posterior stays at 0.999. Now, what happens if someone isn't so certain about their own identity? They may have something with a lower prior. Well, the number goes up. How much it goes up and what it does to them and how they feel about themselves or what they do with themselves is an individual liberty decision. And therefore, this is a personal informed decision. I wouldn't have done it if not for this presentation. Okay, now let's move on to the second major topic, which is the origins of these four maternal founder lineages that we have been focusing on. And I think I maybe use a little bit of water. See, my mouth is dry. That's possible. I should have brought it up. Thank you. So, why is this a question? Well, in the original... Thank you, Brian. What happens when I get excited? All the time. So, in the original paper by Doron and many others, many in the audience, there was the statement that these founder lineages, circumstantial evidence that they are of Levant origin. Subsequently, much more recently, there appeared a paper which got a lot of attention, which put forth the idea that indeed there are these four founding lineages. It's hard to deny that because they're easily measurable, but that their origin is prehistoric European and not in the Levant. So this is of some scholarly interest. Does it really have any other interest? I contend not. That is to say, I'll give you sort of an argument of why not, but certainly if not, no relevance to Jewish identity questions as far as I can tell. So even in ultra-Orthodox Judaism, the origin of the mother is not relevant to their Jewish identity so long as it goes back a couple of generations. It really, rabbinical inquiry ceases by halachic law before that. So really, this is not a question that has some kind of relevance, but certainly an interesting scholarly question that has historical interest. And I would like to present very briefly 3 lines of evidence that support the Levant rather than the prehistoric European origin of these lineages, just for interest's sake. And I have to apologize because I'm not sure if any of the authors of the more recent article in Nature Communications, I think it was, from Martin Richards' group are here. It's really a bit unfair to present arguments when the other authors are not here to refute them or correct them, but I'll do so anyway with that cautionary note. And 3 lines of evidence, very briefly: phylogenetic evidence, sampling evidence, and just a little bit of ancient DNA findings of recent interest. So in that paper, Costa et al. Display Ashkenazi lineages nested within European lineages, in turn nested within Near Eastern lineages. That's from figure 1 in their publication. And let's say these are 2 out of those 4 lineages with how they appear in that very paper, with green Near East and Europe in that pink color. Now, this tree includes some extreme hotspot positions which were used to construct the major branches. So one of them here, and another here. So this second one, 16093, is found 76 times in the U8 tree within that very Costa et al. Paper. And 195 is found 38 times in the same U8 tree of Costa et al. So, there you see it again. So then, we have this cautionary note, which appears in an earlier paper, on which one of the authors of this paper, of this Costa et al. Paper is an author, going back to 2006, saying that depending on the focus of phylogenetic analysis, one might wish to disregard or give a low weight to extreme hotspot transitions, including these 2, 195 and 16093. So I would contend or put forth that we really shouldn't be relying on these trees that are based on these and claim them to be real haplogroups as opposed to putative haplogroups, which they are actually designated in the paper. So if we now do that, we can have a revised phylogenetic tree where these putative haplogroups are collapsed, and then you see all their subhaplogroups, including K1A9, emanate from the very root of K1 directly, without invoking these other putative subhaplogroups. And that's also true for other Near East haplogroups shown here, which are also enumerated in some of the supplementary data. Now we have a phylogeny structure which is very similar, as you'll see, to Doron's 2006 paper, and much same argumentation can be brought forth for the other major lineages. And this is the going back to 2006, Behar et al. And if we look at K1A9, for example, it emanates from the root of K1, which is frequent in the Near East. K1A1 is also common in the Near East, but K1A1B1 seems to be currently solely European, dating back 12,000 years before present, certainly sufficient time for a range expansion. The question then is the Ashkenazi K1A1B1A European or Near Eastern, but if Near Eastern, from a now low frequency of an extinct parent lineage that was in the Near East? And here we can look elsewhere. And indeed, one sees at various locations in North Africa, and in the Near East, and more recently in the Khyber Pass, and in India. I believe Dr. Chaubey, in this very recent paper, 2016, is here, and we'll hear about it. So it makes it very unlikely that this arose in Europe when one can see its immediate parent and it in various locations around the world. How could this occur? Why don't we see it more frequently? Well, there are 2 phenomena, one called lineage extinction and then sample bias. So the strong effect of genetic drift in isolated populations, of course, causes lineage growth, as we heard, let's say, for Ashkenazi Levites and others, the Y chromosome, but also lineage extinction, and this is work by Livni et Livni, recently published. So, for example, in a population with a limited number of founder lineages, with time, only a very small subset will remain, and we will not see in the extant populations those remnants, and one sees extinction of perhaps 8% of the parent population, and that limits our ability to draw inferences about the ancestral population. There's also a sampling issue. So the available number of DNA samples from the Near East in these studies is much smaller than the less diverse European sample set. Therefore, in order to draw an inference, one will need to do a very much greater sampling than was done, and that's the numbers are shown here. In the interest of time, I'll skip them. But an analogy, I think, which is perhaps useful, is to say if we were to look at mtDNA lineages at high frequency, let's say in a large African-American sample set in the United States today, and find them to be absent in a much smaller sub-Saharan African country sample set, that doesn't mean that the African-Americans are of North American origin, right? It just means that there's different sampling and different processes that occurred. This very interesting paper, I think, was also gives us room for thought. and this was Fernandez et al., in which ancient DNA was examined, and some validated mtDNA signals or sequences appear there, and it's from their paper, and 2 spots, Tel Halula and Tel Ramad, and in a cluster analysis, one can see that the mtDNA from these ancient samples clusters most closely to the mtDNA of Ashkenazi Jews, and one can see that there are 5 of the 15 samples have K motifs, which are not proven to be, but certainly consistent with the K1A9 lineages. Before concluding, I do want to make a very important point, I think, to me anyway, about studying the Y chromosome as a locus, studying mtDNA as a locus, what this means about the rest of our genome. So obviously, every genomic region has its own demographic and evolutionary history. The number of founding lineages of each autosomal locus is not implied by the number of mtDNA founder lineages and requires its own separate analysis. Determinants then of the genome-wide bottleneck, which we heard about and Shai Karmi is going to speak about for, let's say, the Ashkenazi community or any other community, and their relation to maternal and paternal founding lineages is not at all obvious and remains to be determined. And finally, going back to societal implications, I want to warn against, this kind of study. So this study appeared and created a lot of furor, really anti-Israel furor, called Genetic Citizenship, DNA Testing, and the Israeli Law of Return, which was just, this paper is extremely provocative and wrong. Amnon Rubinstein, Professor Amnon Rubinstein, who also served in the government, really revealed the agenda behind a paper like that, which tries to say that Israel is about to do biological testing as a measure. Well, nothing could be further from the truth. So the summary of my view of the societal implications and recommendations, individuals do have a right, I wouldn't say entitlement, but a right at least to utilize DNA to learn about their ancestry if they so wish. Agencies and governments should not have access to that for making these kinds of decisions. mtDNA testing is not an automatic buy-in, but once asked and testing being done, it is important, and I think it's incumbent upon us in this room to be able to interpret their meaning as an interpretation that might affect their freedom of their individual self-perception if they so wish. So there are many people I could acknowledge. I have a number of, and many of them in the audience, and I thank them all. I thank you for your attention.
If there are people attending the NHGRI meeting, they should be making their way to the Decker Hall.
And are there any questions for Karl? So, Karl, of course, another way of modifying these probabilities is to look at more loci, such as your autosomal, such as your non-Y nuclear genome. How does that factor into your thinking?
Yeah, I think that it doesn't help if you take a purely genealogic matrilineal approach. It could enter in, I think, and again, I would defer to somebody like Shai Karmi or others here, into the prior. Okay, one sees that in a Bayesian approach. For example, again, I don't know the numbers, but it may be that in a Bayesian approach, a restricted community disease-causing founder mutation, a carrier state for that, might be every bit as useful or most in moving a prior to a posterior, which is higher than mtDNA, if one doesn't also invoke the matrilineal lineage. Yaniv.
Very interesting talk, Karl. Thank you very much. So I have a question about, you talked about if the government or organizations can use genetic information, right?
I know even if we don't want them to, they can.
They can, yeah. And the questions about the ethical aspect about that, right? So I agree maybe for questions about identity and citizenship, it is, we don't want something like that. But let's say for insurance, right? We know that different ancestries carry different types of diseases, and you prefer something about liabilities, right? Just looking at the ancestry from the DNA. Your view about using DNA, doesn't it basically just genetic DNA exceptionalism? Why not just another source of information? And if the individual has access to this type of information, why not the organization, the insurer, for instance?
Right. Okay. I think that's a terrific question. It's been dealt with in writing many times, and we all think about it a lot. I think a really excellent article is called entitled key word in your question, genetic exceptionalism. It's a whole article that speaks about why HIV testing, okay, and DNA testing are different. I mean, why lipid levels are different, okay? And there are arguments pro and con, and certainly insurance companies, not government insurance companies, which pay dividends and answer to their shareholders, use lipid levels to charge different premiums. That's sort of corporate, that's part of the corporate world. But what I'm saying is, when I say agencies and governments know in the Israeli health system, you know, that there is no differential health coverage based on that. And I would say then that similarly, and even more so for DNA, because of its broader implications with respect to others, not that these other biomarkers are inheritable, but the nature of the inheritance, I think, is different. So I think it's not a simple question, and I would go the other direction. We should not use these other markers either to differentially allocate resources. Thank you.
Hi, my name's Warren Kruger. My question is, just from a strictly historical perspective, one idea is that, you know, the Jews engaged in a lot of trading activity and set up colonies throughout the Indian Ocean and then also in the Mediterranean and in Europe. And that when these Jewish traders, who perhaps were primarily men, went there, they would marry local women. And so the question, I guess, and you didn't really touch upon this, is how does the story of the Y chromosomes versus the mitochondrial, they seem quite different, suggesting support for that hypothesis. And, you know, is that in fact true, or am I just misreading the data because of the differences in the biology?
There are only 20 minutes, and I thought I would speak about the most contentious question possible rather than 20 minutes.
More of a historical.
But yeah, no, but that's very important. And reading again, there, you know, I would defer to Doron and many others, and Richard and others. I think one can see a sex difference in patterns of migration and founding. So some communities, if you look at the Counting the Founders paper, which was another one of Doron's masterpieces, one can see maternal founding lineages. Origins were not described in those papers to one location, other event, or otherwise. But in some cases, clearly local. Okay? And by the way, this pattern of men on the move, more than women on the move, is a little different than what Mark Stoneking and others had described with women on the move more. So this is something that typifies, I think, this trading, migration. We're now the Indian community, the Indian subcontinent, Asian communities. One sees this, but one sees some cases in which men and women move together. So I think every community has its own story to be told, to be studied, and so forth. And it you know, again, I think in every point of view, it makes no difference with respect to their current Jewish identity.
Very good, thank you.
Thank you.